Welcome back, listeners, to Sandman Stories Presents, a folklore podcast where I read you to sleep or until the next story. I'm your host, Dustin. Today we are back in the book of Korean fairy tales by W.E. Griffis. This is one of those stories about a silly country bumpkin who has not seen a mirror before. Okay, let's begin. The Mirror That Made Trouble. The city of Seoul lies near the Han River, which flows all the way across Korea from the high mountains to the sea level. To most Korean people, in the old days when no one traveled abroad, Seoul was the center of the universe. All roads in the kingdom led to this wonderful city, in which there were big shops and stores and gay streets full of lively people in rich clothing. The gentlemen in their stiffly starched and glistening white clothes walked very proudly with their heads up in the air. When they straddled the little Korean ponies, which are not much bigger than Newfoundland dogs, it seemed as if elephants were trying to ride on donkeys. From morning to night, the avenues were full of traffic and business. All the wonderful things brought by the Arabs from India and by the merchants from Japan and China could be bought in the Korean capital. 1,000 bulls loaded with dry grass and firewood came through the city gates into Seoul every day. They could be seen passing along, but not much beside legs and tail and horns were visible. At breakfast and supper time, clouds of blue smoke rose up from the 10,000 low and often underground chimneys, carrying the heat and fire from the kitchens, where good things to eat were cooked. The cartloads of bags of rice, millet, barley, fruits and vegetables, goodies and cookies, jars and crockery seen in the shops would make a mountain. Palaces, pagodas, temples, and mansions of the nobles and wealthy people made the palace in which the king lived very beautiful. While out beyond were the high stone city walls, white or covered with vines. When the sun dipped below the mountains, the gates were shut, and after that no one could enter until morning. At every closing and opening of the gates, the musicians played lively tunes, and the great bell told out the time of sunrise and sunset. In the band there were drums, fifes, trumpets, and stringed instruments. At night, from inside the house and wine shops, one could hear the sounds of revelry, music, song, and dancing and feasting, which often lasted until morning. Out on the great South Mountain, a mighty fire burned and the flames shot high up into the air. This was the welcome message that all was peaceful throughout the whole kingdom. On hilltop and mountain, from the snowy peaks of the ever-white mountain to the islands out in the southern sea, and from the east to the west coast, these signal fires blaze. Flame answering flame made a telegraph announcing that all was well. But at 9 o'clock, Seoul outdoors was a woman's city. All boys and men must be off the streets. Any male person caught by the police would be taken to the magistrate's office, and there receive a severe beating with wooden paddles by the public spankers. Then the women and grown-up girls, old and young, went outdoors, breathed the air, took their walks, made their visits, and had a delightful time with play and chat and gossip. But by midnight, everyone must be indoors. It was no wonder then that in the country the farmers and the village folk thought that Seoul, the capital, was the most splendid city on earth. If they ever heard of London and Paris and New York, they supposed that these places on a map were only villages. How was it possible that any city could equal or surpass Seoul? Why, the very idea was nonsense. In every hamlet, even the children hoped someday to see the city. Often they dreamed of riding through the air on the dragon's back in order to get there. It was thought that anything which a mortal man, or even the insatiable tokebi, should require, could be bought in Seoul. Now in a village up north, which in English we should call Cucumberville, lived a miller, Mr. Kim, and his wife, Cho. The man had worked hard for many years and heaped up piles of iron and brass cash, which he kept hidden under the rafter beneath the roof. He had long intended to see the royal city, and his wife encouraged him, for she wanted a new dress and a comb and a pair of shoes such as the city people wear. His daughters said that they would like to have girdles, ermine-trimmed slippers, and silver hairpins. Kim felt that he must surely go, to please both himself and his family. So one fine May morning he started off to walk to Seoul and see the sights. His wife and daughters, bowing down with their faces to the paper carpet, begged him to bring them pretty things they talked about so much, and also whatever might please himself. His faithful spouse bade him beware of thieves and robbers, and to not let his money lie around loose in the inns by the way. When in Seoul, he must not go into the wine shops, or to see the dancing girls called gisang, or to spend his cash foolishly. There were many wicked men about, and she had heard that besides the polite people, there were boors even in the capital. This she thought must surely be the fact, for there was a proverb that said so. On his part, Kim cautioned his wife, since it was still chilly weather, to keep the kitchen fires burning so as to have the house warm and to not let the girls take cold. She must also beware of robbers. These bad men had a habit of coming after midnight when the fire was out, and quietly loosening the stones of the foundation under the floor and getting inside and also into the rooms through the flues. The house must be well locked up and the door barricaded at night so that no prowling leopard or tiger roaming around should get in. If she heard any scratching or clawing on the roof, she was to strike the gong. This would alarm the villagers, and then the men would rush out with torches and drive away the beasts of prey. If she should hear the pigs squealing out in the pen, she must sound the alarm, for the tigers love Korean pork even more than Korean people. Now Kim was a first-rate fellow. When at home he was pretty sharp at a bargain while buying beans, millet, or rice, and was skillful in grinding barley or chopping up straw for the donkeys. But once inside the walls of the big city, one would think he carried his head under his armpits, as the Koreans say, for amid so many strange sights and sounds he was dazed. Like a great gawk, he stood on the main street with his mouth wide open. As the crowds went by, he wondered where all the people came from and how they all got a living. He found the saying true that there are rude people even in Seoul, for one fellow shouted at him, asking him whether he intended to swallow the moon. Some of the boys laughed at him and said his mouth was like a bird box and something might fly in. Kim looked at many things in these shops, but when he asked how much they cost, he nearly fainted. He was truly scared at the price and he walked on. However, he bought some pretty things for his wife and daughters, such as a fan, a roll of silk for a dress, a box of hairpins, some amber beads, and a silver ring, so that when his eldest daughter, who was soon to marry, became a bride, she would have everything ready. While in the silk shop, the clerk who sold him the goods saw that Kim was from the country and thought he could have a little fun. So he told Kim about the fairies and pointed out a shop across the way. There, if he looked at the round thing which the shopman would gladly show him, he would see and feel as if he never felt or saw before. At once Kim went across the street and over to the shop, where they made the metal things, bright, shining, polished, and silvery. There he stood in front of a round thing like the moon. In it was a man's face. It was the face of someone he thought he knew. It was a man about his own age, he fancied, yet he could not tell just who it was or call him by name. But surely he had seen the person before. When he turned around suddenly, hoping to surprise a friend and perhaps a neighbor from his hometown, there was nobody near. He looked again. There it was. Had his friend hid himself and then come back? When Kim dodged, he lost sight of the face, but when standing in front of this round thing, there was that same man again in the mirror, for that is what the shining metal was. When Kim laughed, the fellow laughed too. When he made a wry face or grimaces, the other person, whoever he was, did the same. No matter how quickly Kim might turn around to catch him, he was gone. Now, Kim had never before seen a mirror, and did not know what it could be. Yet, thinking it was almost like a fairy magic, he bought the metal disc and took it back with him. When he arrived at home, he must first unpack all the boxes containing the pretty things for the women of his family, for the girls were impatient to see what their father had brought them. They were so absorbed in their gifts that they did not notice what Mr. Kim had bought for himself. So he laid the case containing the mirror on the table and put some other purchases away in the big cabinet, inlaid with mother of pearl, that stood in the best room. Then he went out to look after his mill and the pigs and the donkey and the bull. No sooner had the girls opened the mirror case than the terrible things happened. The mother, who was behind the daughter, saw the face of a young woman and was startled at beholding a stranger, as she thought, in her house. Instantly she broke out in a fit of jealous passion. "Your father has brought home another woman, a Gisang from Seoul, to take my place. What does he mean?" At the same time, the daughter, seeing a face in the polished metal, cried out, "No, mother, we won't have any strange woman in your place. Besides, she's too young and will be a tyrant to us." Hearing the loud voices and crying, the grandmother hobbled in and asked what was the matter. "Look, see for yourself what our daddy has brought home to us to make us miserable." Seeing the mirror, Granny looked into it for a moment. Then she too burst out into a passion and cried out, "I won't have this old woman in our house. It's enough for my son to support me and his family. Oh, why did he go to Seoul?" By this time, there was such a racket with the 4 women, young, middle-aged, and old, crying so lustily, that each one quickly used up the 3 paper handkerchiefs apiece before they could dry their tears. While still crying out, "Aigo, aigo," very loudly, Grandfather came in, shaking his stick and ordering them to be quiet. Then, looking at their streaming faces and dropping tears, he demanded to know the cause of the trouble. "See for yourself," said his wife. Then she handed him the metal troublemaker, such as never before had been seen in the village. At once the old man turned almost purple with rage. "What?" he cried in his creaked voice. "Is my son so unfilial as to bring home another old man into the house? How can he support 2 fathers? Where will he get the kimchi and the millet for the old fellow to eat?" Then he threw the mirror into its box and slammed down the lid tight. All this time, while jealousy was eating up these angry people and threatening to disrupt the family, the noise increased so greatly that the husband left his pigs and his mill and rushed in to see what was the matter. At once his wife, who was a very strong woman, flew at him and, seizing his topknot, pulled him and dragged him over the floor and outdoors, along out into the street, never stopping till she reached the house of the judge to tell her troubles. There she made out a terrible story. Once in the presence of a great man who wore a mighty hat and had a string of amber beads hung over his ear, she told the story of what her husband had brought back from Seoul to destroy the peace of his family. Surely he meant to go back to the capital and have a young wife. In her anger, her tongue never stopped a moment. She charged her husband with all the crimes known in the codes. Yet all that she could prove against him was that he had brought back something round, made of metal, into the house. She assured the judge that it was as full of evil magic as Tokebi and all of his imps. Now the other members of the family joined in the accusation of the miller. Besides supporting the wife's story, they all declared that it was true in every detail, because the 5 witnesses all agreed in their story. When the flood of talk had subsided somewhat, the judge, who meanwhile had kept smoking on his brass-bowled pipe, the stem of which was a yard long, while the bowl was only as big as a chestnut, asked, "In what form did you say this evil magic came?" At this, the miller's old father produced the box, opened it, and handed the metal mirror to the judge, who had never before seen anything like it. In fact, he had never been out of his district except once, when he went to the examination years before in Seoul. Even then, he was so much with his fellow students, and so long shut up in his little cell writing out his essays, that he hardly saw anything of the city. When he held up the mirror before his eyes, he suddenly became like a demon in his rage, and behaved just like the other people in the courtroom. On the face of the round thing which he held in his hand, he saw a man in official robes, such as only the men of eminence wear. He had on his head a high round hat, like those which only magistrates will ever put on, while on his right ear hung a string of 28 big round amber beads. When he held the mirror down in front of him, he discerned also the embroidered breastpiece and the little silver stork that served to hold together the folds of the judge's coat of office, while around his waist was a decorated girdle. All this made him almost choke with anger at the idea of another magistrate should come into the village of Cucumberville to take his place. What should he himself do for a salary? If he lost his position, how would he support his old parents and his 25 poor relations? He saw himself as a pauper in his old age. Speechless with rage, there was a silence in the courtroom for at least a minute. All looked at each other to see what would come next. But the peace lasted no longer than 30 seconds, for the storm broke out again in full force when the jealous wife seized her husband by his topknot to drag him home. She feared that the magistrate himself was so angry and jealous that he might adjourn the court. Just when the hullabaloo was at its height, a messenger rushed into the courtroom to announce that the royal inspector direct from the king was on his travels of observation in the province. Within 5 minutes he would be at the gate of the courthouse. Instantly the jealous wife let go of her husband's topknot. The magistrate called for order and posted his under-officers in their places, according to the etiquette of welcoming the king's agents. Then the magistrate, adjusting his hat and topknot, which had been badly tumbled in his passion, went out to greet his worship, the royal inspector. Salutations over, he waved his hand to his superior to take the chief seat of honor. As soon as all formalities were over, the high officer inquired into the cause of the troubles and into the merits of the case. The local magistrate put the mirror onto a silken cushion and handed both to His Highness, the inspector, saying, "Please, your worship, it is this that had turned us all into devils of jealousy. What is it?" Then this gentleman from the capital, who was every day accustomed to the comforts and conveniences of the great city and the splendor of the palace, explained what a mirror was. He gave them all a mild scolding for their folly and dismissed them, telling them that whenever he or she felt angry or jealous, to go out and pull off tops of 5 turnips, or to slowly drink a cup of rice water before speaking an angry word. Thereupon the miller's wife fell over on her face and begged the pardon of her husband. Then all the family, young and old, while walking home, laughed heartily at their mistakes. When a Korean begins to laugh, it is sometimes hard for him to stop, but after half an hour all was quiet again. After that, nearly everyone who could afford it bought a mirror. All the people in the village, sooner or later, possessed one. They used it to look into its face so often to see their own, that the oiled maple carpeting in front of the mirror was in many houses soon worn out. In Seoul, the mirror makers wondered what happened in Cucumberville, the village, so long famous for only its cucumbers, but they slapped their thighs for joy and grew rich. The end. Well, quite a few times in that story I had to edit out a phrase or change something because it was all about, oh, women talking. I was just like, tired of that. And I don't really like the part of picking on country bumpkins as being ignorant. There are plenty of people who live in the countryside that are wise about the world. I also struggle sometimes with thinking that people are ignorant when they don't know something that I think is obvious. But then I realize that there's a bunch of stuff that they know that I have no idea on, so I should really be more humble and compassionate. Still, I like how the people seeing the mirror for the first time thought that they had all been replaced and it was a comedy of errors. Also, seeing as it's 420, this is coming out on my father's 70th birthday. So Pops, happy 70th, and I love you very, very much. See you soon. And the podcast shoutout is to The Endless Knot, hosted by Mark and Aven. This show marries the idea of etymology with the historical sources that we have to go with it. Usually their show starts off with a cocktail, then a quick video where Mark explains a bunch of related word histories on a theme like rock and roll. And then Mark and Aven talk about what classics have to say about the words and how those cultures influenced how those words are used today. They recently had one about patrons and Patreons and Bellinis, and it was super cool. It's all very interesting, and I feel lucky to have appeared on one of their episodes. And so if you like them as much as I do, go and give them a listen, a rating, and a review. And the listener shout-out is to Southern Savonia, Finland. You are 11% of my listeners from Finland. And the capital is Mikkeli. Its English equivalent would be St. Michael's. It is the largest city in Southern Savonia and is home to some very early cave paintings that show that people have been there for thousands of years. It was also the location of the uprising in the 1500s called the Cudgel War. I used to babysit for a family with a Finnish father, and so I got to learn a little bit of Finnish, and I also like to listen to Apulanta. And so I hope I don't butcher this too much. Kiitos ja hyvää yötä. Thank you, and good night.